Officer Jake Mitchell's radio crackled to life just as his trembling hand reached for the basement door handle, Ranger's low whine echoing through the stifling Arizona heat. The German Shepherd had been staring at this abandoned house for 17 days straight, refusing food, water, even shade. What Jake found behind that door wasn't an empty basement. It was 7 pairs of eyes blinking up at him from the darkness. Ranger collapsed against Jake's legs, finally allowing his exhausted body to rest. The dispatcher's voice grew frantic as backup units screamed toward Desert Rose Lane, their sirens cutting through the desert silence like broken glass. Jake's mind flashed to Linda's last words. "Trust that dog's heart, honey. He sees what we can't." These children had been missing for months, written off as runaways by a system too broken to care. "Get child services here now," Jake whispered into his radio, his voice barely steady. How many other houses was Ranger trying to show them? And how much time did they have left? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The desert town of Millbrook, Arizona, had always been the kind of place where neighbors still waved from their porches, and the diner served coffee strong enough to wake the dead. With barely 3,000 souls scattered across sun-baked streets lined with adobe houses and struggling businesses, it was a community where everyone knew everyone else's story, or thought they did. Jake Mitchell had been telling himself he was fine for 18 months now, ever since Linda's funeral. At 58, the former Army veteran carried himself with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that falling apart wasn't an option. His weathered hands, scarred from roadside bombs in Afghanistan, now gripped coffee cups instead of rifle stocks. But the tremor never quite went away. The modest ranch house on Saguaro Street felt cavernous without Linda's laughter echoing through the rooms, and most nights Jake found himself talking to her empty chair at the kitchen table. "Well, honey, looks like they want to put us both out to pasture," he'd say to the silence, scratching behind the ears of the gray-muzzled German Shepherd stretched across Linda's side of the bed. Ranger had been Jake's shadow for 14 years, ever since they'd both limped home from the same God-forsaken desert where Sergeant Mike Chen had died, saving their unit from an IED. The dog's amber eyes held the same haunted look that Jake saw in his own mirror each morning, the weight of surviving when good men didn't. At 9 years old, Ranger moved with the careful dignity of an aging warrior, his once powerful frame now carrying the burden of hip dysplasia and early arthritis. The Millbrook Police Department's newest budget proposal wanted to retire him, claiming a dog his age was a liability they couldn't afford. Chief Patricia Hernandez had been dancing around the subject for weeks, her conversations peppered with phrases like transition period and departmental efficiency. The truth was simpler and crueler. An old dog and an older cop didn't fit the image of a modern police force, even in a town where the biggest crime was usually teenagers spray painting the water tower. Jake's financial situation wasn't helping his case. Linda's cancer treatment had drained their savings faster than summer rain disappeared into desert sand. The medical bills kept coming even after she was gone, and the mortgage payment due next week would clean out what little remained in their checking account. He'd already called the bank twice asking for extensions, each conversation more humiliating than the last. But every morning, Ranger would pad to the front door with the same purposeful energy he'd shown in Afghanistan, ready to serve. The dog's loyalty was absolute, unshakable, and it shamed Jake into getting out of bed when grief threatened to pull him under. They were both broken, both running on borrowed time, but they still had each other. "One more day, old boy," Jake would whisper as they headed out on patrol. "Just give me one more day to matter." He had no idea that Ranger was about to give him the most important 17 days of his life. The morning of May 15th started like any other in Millbrook, with the desert sun already promising another scorching day by the time Jake and Ranger began their patrol route. The thermometer on the bank sign read 87 degrees at 7 a.m., and the weatherman was calling for temperatures to climb past 110 by afternoon. Jake had learned to start early in Arizona. The heat could kill you if you weren't careful, and an aging German shepherd needed extra consideration. They were making their usual swing through the older residential area when Ranger suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. Jake looked up from his clipboard, expecting to see a cat or maybe a roadrunner that had caught the dog's attention. Instead, Ranger was staring at 247 Desert Rose Lane with an intensity that made the hair on Jake's neck stand up. The house was a two-story adobe structure that had seen better decades. Paint peeled from its walls like sunburned skin, and the front yard was a graveyard of dead landscaping and sun-bleached trash. Everyone in town knew it had been empty for years, ever since old Mr. Gutierrez had died and his family couldn't afford to maintain it. The windows were boarded up, and a faded no trespassing sign hung crooked on the front gate. "Come on, boy," Jake called, tugging gently on Ranger's leash. Nothing there but pack rats and memories. But Ranger wouldn't budge. The dog sat down on the cracked sidewalk, his amber eyes locked on the house's front door, as if he were waiting for someone to answer. Jake had seen this behavior before, in Afghanistan, when Ranger had detected roadside bombs or hidden insurgents. The dog's entire body radiated focused attention, his ears forward, his breathing controlled and steady. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. The sun climbed higher, and Jake felt sweat beginning to soak through his uniform shirt, but Ranger remained motionless. Passing cars slowed as drivers recognized the familiar sight of Officer Mitchell and his canine partner. But today, something felt different. Today felt wrong. Mrs. Eleanor Winston emerged from her house across the street, her 82-year-old frame moving carefully down her front steps. She'd lived in the neighborhood for 60 years and had known Jake since he was a teenager mowing lawns to save money for his first car. "That dog of yours been sitting there since before dawn," she called out, shading her eyes with a gnarled hand. "Saw him from my kitchen window when I got up to make coffee. Thought maybe you'd lost him, but he's just watching." Jake felt his stomach tighten. Ranger had never exhibited this kind of fixated behavior during their routine patrols. The dog was disciplined, well-trained, and responsive to commands. This felt like something else entirely, something that reminded Jake uncomfortably of the way Ranger had acted in combat zones when danger was near. "Did you see anything unusual last night?" Jake asked Mrs. Winston, though he wasn't sure what he expected to hear. "Can't say I did," she replied, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Though now that you mention it, I did hear some odd sounds around midnight. Thought it might be those teenagers again looking for a place to drink beer and raise hell, but it was more like, I don't know, like someone moving furniture around." Jake studied the house more carefully. The property record showed it was owned by something called Desert Holdings, LLC, a company that didn't seem to exist anywhere else he could find. The utilities had been disconnected 3 years ago, according to the city office, but Mrs. Winston's comment about sounds in the middle of the night planted a seed of doubt in his mind. He tried calling Ranger to heel one more time, using the firm voice that had never failed to get the dog's attention. Ranger's ears twitched, acknowledging that he'd heard the command, but he didn't move. Instead, he let out a low, almost inaudible whine, the kind of sound Jake had learned meant his partner was trying to communicate something important. The radio on Jake's shoulder crackled to life. "Unit 7, what's your location?" "Desert Rose Lane," Jake responded, still watching Ranger's unwavering focus on the abandoned house. "Conducting a neighborhood check." "Copy that. We've got a report of a missing child in the Riverside area. 14-year-old girl last seen yesterday evening. Can you head over there?" Jake looked down at Ranger, who had finally turned his head to meet his partner's eyes. The dog's expression was almost human in its intensity, as if he were trying to will Jake to understand something vital. 10-4, Jake said into his radio. En route. But as they walked back to the patrol car, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving something important behind. Ranger followed reluctantly, looking back over his shoulder at the house until it disappeared from view. That night, Jake lay awake thinking about his partner's behavior, about Mrs. Winston's mysterious sounds, and about a missing 14-year-old girl whose name was Maria Santos. Day 2 brought no relief from Ranger's obsession. If anything, the German Shepherd's fixation on 247 Desert Rose Lane had intensified overnight. Jake arrived for his morning shift to find 3 missed calls on his voicemail, all from Mrs. Winston, all reporting that "that dog of yours" had been sitting outside the abandoned house since before sunrise. When Jake drove up to the location, his heart sank. Ranger wasn't just sitting anymore. He was pacing a tight circle in front of the property's rusted gate, his movements agitated and purposeful. The dog's usual disciplined demeanor had given way to something Jake had only seen once before, in the minutes before their convoy had hit that IED outside Kandahar. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured as he approached with a leash, but Ranger barely acknowledged his presence. The dog's nose worked frantically, testing the air for scents that only he could detect. When Jake tried to coax him away, Ranger planted himself firmly on the sidewalk and refused to budge, his amber eyes never leaving the boarded-up windows of the house. The temperature was already climbing toward 95 degrees, and Jake watched with growing concern as Ranger panted heavily in the unforgiving Arizona sun. The dog had always been smart about heat management, seeking shade and conserving energy during the hottest parts of the day. This behavior was completely out of character. Jake's radio crackled with the voice of Chief Patricia Hernandez. "Mitchell, I need you in my office when you get a chance. We've got some departmental matters to discuss." The tone in her voice made Jake's stomach clench. At 55, Chief Hernandez had been running the Millbrook Police Department for 8 years with the efficiency of someone who understood that small-town policing was equal parts law enforcement and community relations. She was fair but firm, and she didn't waste time on pleasantries when there was business to conduct. Jake found her in her office an hour later, reviewing budget spreadsheets with the grim expression of someone balancing numbers that didn't want to balance. Behind her desk, framed commendations from her 27-year career shared wall space with photos of her daughter Carmen and granddaughter Sophia, the pride and joy of her life. "Sit down, Jake," she said, without looking up from her papers. "We need to talk about Ranger." The words Jake had been dreading for months finally hung in the air between them. He settled into the chair across from her desk, feeling every one of his 58 years in his aching joints. "The city council met last night," Chief Hernandez continued, setting down her pen and fixing him with a direct stare. "Budget cuts are coming whether we like it or not. The K-9 program is expensive. Veterinary bills, training costs, specialized equipment. They want to know if we can justify keeping it operational." Jake felt his jaw tighten. Ranger's served this community for 12 years. He's found missing persons, detected drugs, assisted in dozens of arrests. How is that not justified? "I'm not questioning his service record," the chief said, her voice gentler now. "But Jake, he's 9 years old. That's retirement age for most working dogs. The insurance company is already asking questions about liability, and Dr. Thompson mentioned his hip dysplasia is getting worse." The mention of Ranger's health issues hit Jake like a physical blow. Dr. Sarah Beth Thompson had been treating Ranger for the past 3 years, carefully managing his arthritis with medication and recommending reduced activity. Jake had been putting off the more expensive treatments, hoping his partner's condition would stabilize. "He's still sharp," Jake insisted. You've seen him work. His nose is as good as it ever was, and his obedience is perfect. Hell, he's better trained than half the officers on this force. Chief Hernandez leaned back in her chair, studying Jake's face. This isn't just about Ranger, is it? Jake, I know the past 18 months have been rough. Linda's death, the medical bills, adjusting to life alone. Nobody expects you to handle all that without it taking a toll. But I need to know that your judgment isn't being compromised by your attachment to that dog. The accusation stung because Jake couldn't entirely dismiss it. His relationship with Ranger had always been closer than typical handler and dog partnerships, forged in the crucible of combat and strengthened by shared loss. The dog wasn't just his work partner, he was family, the only family Jake had left. My judgment is fine, Jake said, though he could hear the defensiveness in his own voice. If anything, Ranger keeps me sharp. We work well together. I'm sure you do, Chief Hernandez replied. But working well together and being obsessed with an abandoned house are two different things. Mrs. Winston called this morning. She's worried about both of you. Jake's face flushed with embarrassment. He should have expected that his behavior would draw attention in a town where everyone watched everyone else's business with benevolent interest. Look, the chief continued, I'm not making any decisions today, but I need you to seriously consider whether it might be time to start thinking about Ranger's retirement. There are good homes available for retired police dogs, places where he could live out his golden years in comfort. The thought of giving up Ranger felt like losing Linda all over again. Jake tried to imagine coming home to an empty house, eating dinner alone, sleeping without the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing beside the bed. The loneliness would swallow him whole. Just think about it, Chief Hernandez said, her tone indicating the conversation was over. And, Jake, try to keep Ranger away from that house on Desert Rose Lane. People are starting to talk, and not in a good way. As Jake walked back to his patrol car, he felt the weight of the chief's words settling over him like desert dust. The rational part of his mind understood her concerns. Ranger was getting older, veterinary bills were mounting, and his recent behavior was certainly unusual. But the part of Jake that had survived Afghanistan alongside this dog knew that Ranger's instincts had never been wrong. Not once. The question was whether Jake's judgment was still clear enough to tell the difference between trusting his partner's abilities and clinging to the past out of desperation. As he watched Ranger return immediately to his vigil at the abandoned house, Jake realized he might be about to find out the hard way. The third day brought a discovery that changed everything. Jake had arrived at Desert Rose Lane before dawn, determined to understand what was driving Ranger's obsessive behavior. He'd brought a thermos of coffee and his patience, planning to observe his partner's actions with the clinical detachment he'd learned in the military. Ranger was already there, of course, sitting in his familiar spot across from the abandoned house, but this time something was different. Instead of his usual motionless vigil, the dog was moving in slow, deliberate patterns around the property's perimeter. His nose worked constantly, testing the air and ground with the methodical precision of a professional tracker. Jake watched for 20 minutes before Ranger suddenly stopped near the northwest corner of the lot, where a struggling Palo Verde tree cast sparse shade across a patch of disturbed earth. The dog began to dig with his front paws, his movements urgent but controlled. Within minutes, he'd uncovered something that made Jake's blood run cold, a child's pink hair ribbon partially buried in the hard-packed dirt. Jake's hands shook as he photographed the ribbon with his phone before carefully placing it in an evidence bag. The fabric was faded but not weathered enough to have been underground for years. Weeks, maybe. A month at most. He looked up at the abandoned house with new eyes, noting details he'd dismissed before. Fresh tire tracks barely visible in the sand near the back gate, a basement window that seemed less securely boarded than the others. His radio buzzed with morning dispatch calls, but Jake ignored them. He was thinking about Maria Santos, the 14-year-old who'd been reported missing 3 days ago. Maria, whose mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Scottsdale and worked double shifts to support her 3 children. Maria, whose disappearance had been classified as a probable runaway because she'd had an argument with her mother about her grades. Jake pulled up the missing persons database on his phone and felt his stomach drop. Maria wasn't the only one. Over the past 6 months, 4 children had been reported missing in Millbrook and the surrounding areas. All of them were between 8 and 14 years old. All of them were from families struggling with poverty, immigration status, or foster care situations. All of them had been written off as runaways by a system that seemed more interested in closing cases than finding children. Lucy Martinez, age 11, last seen walking home from school. Foster child, history of behavioral problems. Tyler Brooks, age 13, disappeared from a group home in Phoenix while visiting relatives in Millbrook. Chronic runaway with multiple placements. Jenny Morrison, age 8, vanished from a convenience store while her mother was working a night shift. Mother was undocumented, afraid to push too hard with authorities. And now Maria Santos, whose only crime was being born into circumstances that made her invisible to a system that should have protected her. Jake stared at the abandoned house and felt a familiar rage building in his chest. The same fury he'd felt in Afghanistan when bureaucrats made decisions that got good soldiers killed. These children weren't statistics or case numbers. They were someone's babies. And they deserved better than being written off as problems that solved themselves. He called Chief Hernandez from his patrol car, his voice carefully controlled as he reported the discovery of the hair ribbon. Her response was predictably cautious. "Jake, I appreciate your diligence, but finding a piece of fabric near an abandoned house doesn't constitute probable cause for a search warrant. Could have been there for months. Could have blown in from anywhere. Chief, I've got 4 missing children, all fitting the same profile, all disappeared within a 6-month window. That's not a coincidence. It's also not evidence of a crime," she replied. "Look, I'll make some calls, see if we can get someone from the county to take a look. But until then, I need you to focus on your regular duties. The Henderson family is having issues with teenagers vandalizing their property, and Mrs. Chen called about suspicious activity in the park." Jake wanted to argue, but he recognized the tone in Chief Hernandez's voice. The conversation was over, whether he liked it or not. He clicked off the radio and looked down at Ranger, who was watching him with those unnervingly intelligent amber eyes. "What do you know that I don't, old boy?" Jake murmured. That afternoon, while completing his routine patrols, Jake decided to conduct his own investigation. He drove to the county courthouse and spent 2 hours diving into property records for 247 Desert Rose Lane. What he found was a shell game of corporate ownership that made his head spin. The house was officially owned by Desert Holdings, LLC, which was registered to an address in Nevada that turned out to be a mailbox service. Desert Holdings was owned by Southwest Properties Group, which was owned by another company, which was owned by another company. The trail went cold after 6 layers of corporate obfuscation, but Jake did discover one interesting fact. Someone had been paying the property taxes on time every year, even though the house was supposedly abandoned. More troubling was the utility information. While the electricity and water had been officially disconnected 3 years ago, Jake's military training had taught him to look for discrepancies. He called his friend Danny Rodriguez, who worked for the electric company, and asked him to check the meter readings for the past 6 months. "That's weird," Danny said after looking up the account. "Shows 0 usage on the bills, but the meter's been turning. Not a lot, but consistent, like someone's running a small generator or something." Jake felt his pulse quicken. "How much usage are we talking about?" "Enough to power some lights, maybe a small refrigerator, or—" Danny paused, clearly uncomfortable with the direction his thoughts were taking. "Or ventilation for a basement room." That evening, Jake sat in his kitchen staring at the evidence spread across Linda's old craft table. Photos of the hair ribbon, printouts of missing children reports, property records, utility anomalies. Ranger lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to look toward the door as if he'd rather be somewhere else. Jake's phone rang, interrupting his brooding. The caller ID showed his daughter Ashley's number from Portland, and he felt a stab of guilt for not calling her in over a week. "Hi, sweetheart," he answered, trying to inject some enthusiasm into his voice. "Dad, you sound tired," Ashley said immediately. She'd inherited her mother's ability to read people through their voices, and Jake had never been able to hide much from her. "Are you taking care of yourself?" "I'm fine, honey. Just working on a case that's got me a little preoccupied." "Is Ranger okay? You mentioned he wasn't feeling well the last time we talked." Jake looked down at his partner, who was now pacing restlessly around the kitchen. He's focused on something. You know how he gets when he's working." Ashley was quiet for a moment. "Dad, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time you considered retiring. You've put in your 25 years. You've got your pension coming. You could move up here, be closer to the grandkids."
"We'd love to have you." The suggestion hit Jake like a physical blow. Retirement meant giving up Ranger, giving up his purpose, giving up the identity he'd built over decades of service. It meant admitting that he was too old, too broken, too irrelevant to matter anymore. "I'm not ready for that yet," he said quietly. "But Dad, Ashley, I love you. But I'm not ready," he repeated, more firmly this time. "There are things here that need doing." After they hung up, Jake sat in the growing darkness of his kitchen, wrestling with doubt. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe he was just a lonely old man clinging to the past, projecting meaning onto a dog's natural curiosity about an interesting smell. Maybe the hair ribbon was nothing more than coincidence, and the missing children were exactly what the system said they were. Runaways who would turn up when they were ready. But then he remembered Maria Santos's mother, Rosa, crying in the police station as she begged someone to take her daughter's disappearance seriously. He remembered the defeated look in the social worker's eyes when she explained that Jenny Morrison's case had been transferred to a different department. He remembered the way Ranger had looked at that house, not with casual interest, but with the focused intensity of a dog who knew something was wrong. Jake made his decision. If the system wouldn't listen to him, he'd have to prove that Ranger's instincts were worth trusting. He gathered his equipment, flashlight, camera, basic surveillance gear, and prepared for a long night. As he and Ranger walked out to the patrol car, Jake thought about Linda's last words to him. She'd been heavily medicated, drifting in and out of consciousness, but her final coherent sentence had been crystal clear. "Trust that dog's heart, honey. He sees what we can't." At the time, Jake had thought she was talking about Ranger's ability to sense her illness, to provide comfort during her darkest hours. But now, sitting in his car across from 247 Desert Rose Lane as the sun set over the Arizona desert, he wondered if Linda had been trying to tell him something more important. Ranger settled into the passenger seat with a contented sigh, as if he finally understood that Jake was ready to listen. For the first time in days, the dog seemed truly at peace, his amber eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight as he watched the house that held all their answers. Jake checked his watch. 8:47 p.m. The real investigation was about to begin. The night surveillance began at 9 p.m., with Jake positioning his patrol car 3 blocks away from Desert Rose Lane to avoid drawing attention. He'd switched off his radio and left his cell phone on silent. This was off the books, and he couldn't afford any interruptions that might compromise his position. Ranger sat alert in the passenger seat, his ears constantly swiveling toward sounds that Jake's aging hearing couldn't detect. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. The abandoned house sat in darkness, its boarded windows like dead eyes staring back at the desert night. Jake fought to stay focused, sipping lukewarm coffee from his thermos and making notes about every car that passed, every shadow that moved, every sound that broke the desert silence. At 11:47 p.m., Ranger's entire body went rigid. The dog's head snapped toward the house, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that made his hackles rise. Jake followed his partner's gaze and saw what had triggered the alert, a faint glow emanating from one of the basement windows. Not electric light, something softer like candlelight or a battery-powered lantern. Jake grabbed his binoculars and focused on the window. The light was definitely coming from inside the house, moving slowly as if someone was carrying it from room to room. As he watched, a shadow passed in front of the light source, a human figure, tall and lean, moving with purpose through what was supposed to be an empty building. His heart hammering, Jake reached for his radio before remembering he'd turned it off. Protocol demanded that he call for backup before investigating further, but Protocol had also written off 4 missing children as runaways. Jake made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was going in alone. "Stay," he whispered to Ranger, but the dog was already moving toward the car door with the determined gait of a professional heading to work. Jake knew better than to argue with that level of conviction. If his partner sensed danger, Jake wanted him close. They approached the house from the east side, using the neighboring property's overgrown landscaping for cover. The desert air was still warm from the day's heat, carrying the scent of creosote and dust that defined Arizona nights. Jake's military training kicked in automatically. Low profile, careful footsteps, constant awareness of surroundings and escape routes. The basement window that had shown the light was now dark, but Jake could hear something that made his blood freeze. Voices. Muffled, indistinct, but definitely human. Multiple people talking in hushed tones somewhere beneath the house. Ranger's nose worked frantically as they crept closer to the foundation. The dog's body language screamed alert, tail stiff, ears forward, every muscle tensed for action. When they reached the window, Ranger pawed at the boards covering it, his claws scratching against wood with barely contained urgency. Jake peered through a gap in the boarding and felt his world shift. The basement wasn't empty. Battery-powered lanterns cast irregular shadows across what appeared to be a living space. Sleeping bags, plastic storage containers, empty food packages scattered across a concrete floor. And in one corner, barely visible in the dim light, Jake saw something that confirmed his worst fears: children's clothing hanging from a makeshift clothesline. The voices were clearer now, and Jake could make out at least 2 distinct speakers. One was a man, his tone calm and controlled as he issued what sounded like instructions. The other voice was higher, younger, a child responding with the careful compliance of someone who had learned that obedience meant survival. Jake's hands shook as he activated his phone's camera, documenting everything he could see through the gap in the boards. This was evidence, real evidence that would force the system to act. But even as he took photos, his mind was racing with tactical considerations. How many perpetrators were down there? How many children? What was the safest way to get them out? Ranger made the decision for him. The dog suddenly bolted toward the back of the house, moving with more speed and agility than Jake had seen from him in months. Jake followed, cursing silently as his partner led him to a basement entrance hidden behind an overgrown Palo Verde tree. The entrance was a set of concrete steps leading down to a heavy wooden door. The door was slightly ajar, and warm air drifted up from the opening, carrying scents that made Ranger whine softly. Human fear, unwashed bodies, and the chemical smell of cheap cleaning supplies used to mask odors. Jake drew his service weapon and used his phone to text a message to Chief Hernandez. 247 Desert Rose. Active situation. Send backup. He knew the text might not go through immediately. Cell service in this part of town was spotty, but it was the best he could do under the circumstances. The voices from below had stopped. replaced by an ominous silence that suggested someone had heard their approach. Jake held his breath, listening for any sign of movement while Ranger pressed his nose to the crack in the door, gathering intelligence that only he could interpret. Then, from somewhere deep in the basement, came a sound that shattered Jake's heart. A child crying. Not the angry tears of a tantrum or the frustrated sobs of disappointment, but the hopeless weeping of someone who had given up believing that help would ever come. Training and protocol went out the window. Jake pushed the door open and started down the steps, Ranger at his side, both of them moving toward the sound of a child in distress. The basement was larger than Jake had expected, stretching beneath what felt like the entire footprint of the house. Battery-powered lanterns provided weak pools of light connected by corridors of shadow. The smell hit him first. Human waste, fear, and desperation concentrated in an underground space with poor ventilation. Then his eyes adjusted enough to see the living arrangements: mattresses on the floor, buckets serving as primitive toilets, plastic storage bins holding what looked like children's belongings. "Police!" Jake called out, his voice echoing off concrete walls. "I'm here to help!" The crying stopped immediately, replaced by the shuffle of movement as people tried to hide in the darkness. Jake advanced slowly, his weapon drawn but pointed at the floor, Ranger moving ahead to clear the space with professional efficiency. They found them in the farthest corner of the basement. 4 children, ranging in age from about 8 to 14, huddled together behind a makeshift barricade of cardboard and blankets. Their faces were pale and dirty, their clothes ill-fitting and stained, but they were alive. Jake holstered his weapon and knelt down, making himself as non-threatening as possible. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm Officer Mitchell. This is Ranger. We're here to get you out of here." The oldest child, a girl with tangled brown hair and eyes that had seen too much, spoke in a whisper. "He said the police wouldn't come. He said nobody cared about kids like us." "Well, he was wrong," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We care, and we're going to make sure you're safe." Ranger approached the children slowly, his tail wagging in the gentle rhythm he reserved for victims who needed comfort rather than protection. One of the younger boys reached out tentatively to touch the dog's fur, and Jake saw some of the tension leave the child's face. "Where is he?" Jake asked, meaning the man whose voice he'd heard earlier. "Gone," the girl replied. "He left when we heard you coming. There's another way out through the tunnel." Jake's radio crackled to life, Chief Hernandez's voice cutting through the static. "Jake, what's your status? We got your text and we're en route." "I've got 4 children down here," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "They're alive, but they need medical attention. Suspect fled the scene through an unknown exit." "Paramedics are rolling," the chief responded. "Are you secure?" Jake looked around the basement prison, taking in the evidence of prolonged captivity, the makeshift living conditions, the terror in these children's eyes. "We're secure," he said. "But Chief, Ranger was right." He was right about everything. As sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, Jake sat with the rescued children and felt something he hadn't experienced since Linda's death: the profound satisfaction of making a difference. Ranger lay down beside the youngest boy, a child who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, offering the kind of comfort that only a therapy animal could provide. The nightmare was over for these 4 children, but Jake knew it was just beginning for him. There were answers that needed finding, justice that needed serving, and a system that needed changing. Most importantly, there were still missing children out there: Maria Santos, Lucy Martinez, and others whose names he might not even know yet. But for now, in this moment, 4 children who had been invisible to the world were safe. And it was all because an old dog had refused to stop believing that their lives mattered.
The rescue operation at 247 Desert Rose Lane should have been Jake's moment of triumph, but 48 hours later, it felt more like a cruel prelude to heartbreak. The 4 children they'd found, Sarah, Miguel, David, and little Amy, were safe in protective custody, receiving medical care and counseling. The basement prison had been processed as a crime scene, yielding DNA evidence, fingerprints, and enough proof to launch a federal investigation. But Thomas Brennan had vanished like smoke in the desert wind, and with him, any chance of finding the other missing children. Jake stood in Chief Hernandez's office, his hands clasped behind his back in a military at-ease position that had become second nature over the decades. The commendation letter on her desk should have filled him with pride, but all he could think about was Maria Santos's mother, Rosa, sitting in the station's waiting room with hope dying in her eyes. "The FBI task force is taking over the investigation," Chief Hernandez said, her voice carefully neutral. "Agent Rebecca Hayes will be coordinating with county and state agencies. They've issued a BOLO for Brennan and expanded the search to include neighboring states." "That's good news," Jake replied, though he could hear the hollowness in his own voice. "Jake." The chief's tone softened. "You did everything right. 4 children are alive because you trusted your instincts and your partner's training. That's a victory by any measure." Through the office window, Jake could see Ranger lying on the station's front steps in the afternoon shade. The old German shepherd had barely moved since they'd returned from the crime scene, his usual alertness replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that worried Jake more than any physical injury. "He's been off his food for 3 days, Jake said, not really addressing the chief's comment. "Dr. Thompson thinks it might be stress-related, but I can see it in his eyes. He knows we're not done. He knows there are still kids out there." Chief Hernandez followed his gaze to the dog on the steps. "Jake, I've been in touch with the veterinary college at UC Davis. They have an excellent retirement program for working dogs." "No." The word came out harder than Jake intended. "We're not having that conversation. Not now." "Look at him," she insisted. "Really look at him. That dog gave everything he had to find those children. He's earned his rest." Jake did look, and what he saw made his chest tighten with grief. Ranger's once powerful frame seemed diminished, his coat lacking its former luster. The dog's breathing was labored, and when he shifted position, Jake could see the wince that accompanied every movement of his arthritic hips. The truth was undeniable. The rescue operation had taken a devastating toll on his partner. Dr. Thompson's examination that morning had revealed elevated stress hormones, signs of dehydration, and a heart murmur that hadn't been present during Ranger's last checkup. The dog, who had been Jake's shadow and salvation for 14 years, was wearing out before his eyes. "The department's medical insurance won't cover extensive treatment for a dog his age," Chief Hernandez continued gently. "And I know your financial situation isn't—" She was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Officer Maria Santos, no relation to the missing girl, appeared in the doorway, her face pale with urgency. "Chief, we just got word from the task force. They found another location." Maria's voice cracked slightly. "An abandoned warehouse outside Phoenix. 3 more children recovered, but—" The pause stretched like a chasm. "But what?" Jake demanded. 2 didn't make it," Maria whispered. "They'd been dead for weeks. And there's no sign of the others we're looking for." Jake felt his knees go weak. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he'd been holding on to the hope that Maria Santos, Lucy Martinez, and the other missing children were still alive, hidden in another basement, waiting for rescue. The news that children had died while they'd been following protocol and waiting for warrants was a weight that threatened to crush him. He stumbled out of the office and down the hallway, past the concerned faces of his colleagues, through the station's front door to where Ranger lay in the shade. The dog lifted his graying head as Jake approached, and in those amber eyes, Jake saw a reflection of his own devastation. "I'm sorry, old boy," Jake whispered, dropping to his knees beside his partner. "I'm so sorry." Ranger struggled to his feet and pressed his muzzle against Jake's chest, offering comfort, even as his own body betrayed him. The gesture broke something fundamental inside Jake, and for the first time since Linda's funeral, he allowed himself to weep openly. Mrs. Eleanor Winston appeared beside them as if materialized from the desert heat, her weathered hands carrying a bowl of cool water. She set it down within Ranger's reach and placed a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. "That dog's heart is bigger than this whole town," she said softly. "But even the biggest hearts have limits." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber that matched Ranger's eyes, Jake realized that their war wasn't over. It might never be over. But for the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't sure if either of them would survive it. The phone call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, shattering Jake's restless sleep with the urgent tone that every law enforcement officer learned to dread. Agent Rebecca Hayes's voice cut through the darkness of his bedroom, clinical and precise in the way that federal agents delivered life-changing information. "We found him," she said without preamble. "Thomas Brennan. He's holed up in a compound outside Tucson with at least 3 other adults and an unknown number of children. We're moving at dawn." Jake was already reaching for his uniform before his mind fully processed the words. Beside him on the bed, Ranger lifted his head, those amber eyes reflecting the pale light from Jake's phone screen. The dog's breathing was labored, each inhale a visible effort that reminded Jake of the veterinarian's stark assessment from the day before: congestive heart failure, advanced arthritis, and a prognosis that measured time in weeks rather than months. "I want to be there," Jake said, his voice rough with sleep and desperation. "Jake, this is a federal operation now. We appreciate everything you and Ranger have done, but—" "Those are our kids," Jake interrupted, the possessive pronoun surprising him with its intensity. "We started this. We deserve to finish it." Agent Hayes was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could hear the calculated assessment happening on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of understanding that hadn't been there before. "Transport leaves from the Phoenix field office at 0500. You and Ranger can ride along, but you follow our lead. This isn't Millbrook anymore, Jake. This is bigger than any of us realized." As Jake dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, his hands shook with a combination of adrenaline and fear that felt familiar from his combat days in Afghanistan. This was what Linda used to call his war face. The careful blankness he wore when the stakes were life and death, and there was no room for emotion to cloud his judgment. Ranger struggled to his feet, his movements stiff and painful to watch. The medications Dr. Thompson had prescribed were helping, but they couldn't turn back time or reverse the damage that years of faithful service had inflicted on the old dog's body. Still, when Jake reached for the tactical vest that marked Ranger as a working K9, the German shepherd's entire demeanor transformed. His ears perked forward, his breathing steadied, and for a moment Jake could see the warrior who had saved countless lives in the deserts of Afghanistan. The drive to Phoenix passed in a blur of desert highways and growing daylight. Ranger rode in the passenger seat, his head out the window despite the early morning chill, testing the air for scents that spoke to instincts older than civilization. Jake found himself memorizing details: the way the rising sun caught the silver in Ranger's muzzle, the familiar rhythm of his partner's breathing, the weight of the dog's head when he occasionally rested it on Jake's leg. The FBI field office buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major operation,
Agent Hayes met them in the parking lot, her expression grim as she outlined the situation. The compound outside Tucson was larger than they'd initially believed. 12 buildings spread across 40 acres of desert scrubland with multiple escape routes and evidence of sophisticated surveillance equipment. "We've identified at least 15 children through thermal imaging," she explained, leading Jake and Ranger toward a command vehicle bristling with communication equipment, ages ranging from 6 to 16. "Some have been there for years, based on what the Phoenix survivors told us." Jake felt his jaw clench at the clinical language that reduced human suffering to tactical data points. These weren't survivors and thermal signatures. They were someone's children, lost souls who had been waiting in darkness for someone to care enough to find them. The tactical briefing revealed the true scope of Brennan's operation. What had started as a single predator in Millbrook was actually part of a trafficking network that spanned 3 states. The compound served as a distribution center, with children being moved regularly to buyers across the Southwest. The casual efficiency of it made Jake's stomach turn. "Brennan's not the mastermind," Agent Hayes continued, pointing to surveillance photos that showed the compound's layout. "He's middle management. The real money is coming from somewhere else, and we need him alive to roll up the entire organization." As the convoy moved toward the compound, Jake found himself thinking about the children they'd rescued from Desert Rose Lane. Sarah, the 14-year-old who had spoken with the weary wisdom of someone twice her age. Miguel, who flinched every time an adult raised their voice. David, who hadn't spoken a word since his rescue. Little Amy, who asked every day when she could go home, not understanding that home might not exist anymore. The compound appeared suddenly out of the desert haze, a collection of prefabricated buildings and trailers arranged in no apparent pattern, surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. It looked like a construction site or a mining operation, deliberately designed to avoid attention from casual observers. Ranger's reaction was immediate and visceral. The dog's hackles rose, and a low growl rumbled in his chest as he caught scents that spoke of fear and confinement. Jake felt his own pulse quicken in response to his partner's alert. Muscle memory from combat zones, where trusting the dog's nose meant the difference between life and death. The assault began at 6:47 a.m., with federal agents moving in coordinated teams toward the compound's perimeter. Jake and Ranger were assigned to the secondary team, tasked with securing the main residential building once the initial breach was complete. As they waited for the go signal, Jake knelt beside his partner and scratched behind the graying ears that had heard the sounds of battle on 2 continents. "One more time, old boy," he whispered. "One more time and then we can rest." The radio crackled with terse updates. "Alpha team in position. Bravo team ready. Charlie team standing by." Then the words that launched them into action: "Execute, execute, execute." The compound erupted in controlled chaos as federal agents breached multiple entry points simultaneously. Jake and Ranger moved toward their assigned building, the dog's training overriding his physical limitations as he fell into the familiar rhythm of tactical operations. Despite his age and illness, Ranger's nose was still sharp, his instincts still finely tuned to the detection of human fear and desperation. They found the first group of children in what had once been a storage room, now converted into a crude dormitory with mattresses on the floor and a single bucket serving as a bathroom. 8 kids, their faces pale and frightened, huddled together in the corner farthest from the door. The youngest couldn't have been more than 6 years old. "Police!" Jake called out softly, holstering his weapon and raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "We're here to help. You're safe now." Ranger approached the children with the gentle dignity that had made him such an effective therapy animal, his tail wagging slowly as he offered comfort to those who needed it most. One by one the children reached out to touch his fur, and Jake saw some of the tension leave their small faces.
But even as they secured the building and began the process of evacuating the rescued children, Jake knew something was wrong. The numbers didn't add up. Thermal imaging had shown 15 children, but they'd only found 12. Somewhere in the compound, 3 kids were still missing. Building 4, southeast corner, Agent Hayes' voice crackled through his radio. We've got reports of an underground bunker. Need K-9 support for search and rescue. Jake looked down at Ranger, whose breathing had become more labored as the morning progressed. The dog's eyes met his, and in that moment Jake saw an acceptance that chilled him to the bone. Ranger knew, with the intuitive wisdom that animals possess, that this would be their final mission together. "Come on, partner," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "Let's bring them home." As they moved toward Building 4, where 3 children waited in darkness for rescue that might never come, Jake realized that some victories came at a price too high to calculate. But some things, like the lives of innocent children, were worth any sacrifice. Even if it meant saying goodbye to the most faithful friend he'd ever known. The underground bunker beneath Building 4 was a testament to human cruelty that defied Jake's ability to comprehend. Accessed through a hidden trapdoor concealed beneath a stack of supply crates, the space stretched 20 feet in each direction, carved directly into the hard desert earth and reinforced with concrete blocks. The air that rose from the opening was thick with the smell of fear, unwashed bodies, and despair so concentrated it seemed to have physical weight. Ranger descended the crude wooden steps first, his arthritic joints protesting each movement but his purpose unwavering. Jake followed, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness that felt alive with suffering. The bunker was divided into 3 small cells, each secured with heavy padlocks that spoke to the systematic nature of the imprisonment. In the first cell, they found Maria Santos. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the 14-year-old girl from the missing persons report. Though weeks of captivity had transformed the bright-eyed teenager from the school photo into a hollow-eyed wraith who flinched at the sound of their approach. She was alive, but the spark that had defined her in her mother's desperate descriptions had been dimmed to barely glowing embers. "Maria?" Jake called softly, keeping his voice gentle as he worked to break the padlock with bolt cutters. "Your mother sent me. Rosa's been looking for you every single day." The girl's eyes widened with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. When the lock finally gave way and Jake opened the cell door, she collapsed against him, her small frame racked with sobs that seemed to contain weeks of suppressed terror and grief. Ranger moved past them to the second cell, where they discovered Lucy Martinez, the 11-year-old who had vanished from a convenience store while her mother worked the night shift. Lucy was in worse condition than Maria, her eyes vacant and unresponsive, her body curled into a protective ball that spoke to trauma beyond Jake's comprehension. The third cell held the most devastating discovery of all. Jenny Morrison, the 8-year-old whose undocumented mother had been too afraid to push authorities for answers. Jenny was unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, her small body showing signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition. "Get paramedics down here now!" Jake shouted into his radio, his professional composure finally cracking as he gathered the unconscious child in his arms. "I need medical support for 3 children, 1 critical." As federal agents and paramedics flooded into the bunker, Jake found himself standing in the corner with Ranger, both of them watching as months of searching finally reached its conclusion. Maria Santos was reunited with her mother through a video call that had Rosa sobbing with relief. Lucy Martinez was loaded onto a stretcher, her vital signs stable, but her psychological state requiring immediate intervention. Jenny Morrison was rushed to the trauma center with paramedics working frantically to stabilize her condition. But even as the rescued children were evacuated to safety, Jake felt a growing dread that had nothing to do with the horrors they'd just witnessed. Ranger had collapsed shortly after they'd found Jenny, his legs giving out as exhaustion finally overwhelmed his determination to keep working. Dr. Thompson's warnings echoed in Jake's mind as he watched his partner struggle to breathe in the thin desert air. And the aftermath of the raid unfolded with the methodical efficiency that defined federal operations. Thomas Brennan was found hiding in a storage shed on the compound's perimeter, his attempt to flee thwarted by his own paranoia about leaving behind evidence that could implicate his handlers. His arrest was anticlimactic, a whimpering surrender that stood in stark contrast to the magnitude of suffering he had helped orchestrate. But Brennan's capture revealed a truth that shattered Jake's hope for simple justice. During his interrogation, the details emerged of a trafficking network that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of conspirators. Brennan was indeed middle management, a replaceable cog in a machine that had been operating for years before his involvement and would continue operating after his imprisonment. "We estimate they've moved over 200 children through this network in the past 5 years," Agent Hayes told Jake as they stood outside the command vehicle, watching as evidence was cataloged and transported. "Some were recovered from other locations, but many are still missing. This is just one tentacle of something much larger." The weight of that revelation settled over Jake like desert dust. 200 children. Families across the Southwest still waiting for phone calls that might never come. Parents like Rosa Santos, who had been fortunate enough to get their children back, but countless others who would continue their vigils at empty kitchen tables and silent bedroom doors. As the convoy prepared to return to Phoenix, Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. He walked over to Agent Hayes and extended his hand in a formal gesture that carried the weight of finality. "This is where Ranger and I get off," he said quietly. "We've done what we came to do." Agent Hayes studied his face, noting the exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. "The task force could use experienced investigators like you, Jake. This network isn't going to dismantle itself." Jake glanced over at Ranger, who was lying in the shade of the command vehicle with his breathing labored and his eyes closed. The old German shepherd had given everything he had to give, pushing his failing body beyond its limits to save 3 more children. The debt of gratitude Jake owed his partner couldn't be repaid with more missions and more suffering. "I appreciate the offer," Jake replied, "but it's time for us to go home." The drive back to Millbrook passed in contemplative silence, broken only by Ranger's increasingly difficult breathing and the soft sound of Jake's tears falling onto his uniform shirt. They had found Maria Santos, Lucy Martinez, and Jenny Morrison. They had exposed a trafficking network that law enforcement agencies were already moving to dismantle. They had saved 15 children from a nightmare that would have continued indefinitely without their intervention, but victory tasted like ashes when measured against the cost. Dr. Sarah Beth Thompson was waiting for them at her veterinary clinic when they arrived in Millbrook, her expression grave as she examined Ranger's condition. The dog's heart murmur had worsened significantly, and his breathing was so labored that she immediately connected him to an oxygen support system. "His heart is failing," she told Jake with the gentle honesty that defined her practice. "The stress of the operation, combined with his age and existing conditions, I'm not sure how much time we have." Jake nodded, having already reached the same conclusion during the long drive home. He sat beside Ranger's bed in the clinic's treatment room, his hand resting on the dog's graying head as machines monitored vital signs that grew weaker with each passing hour. Chief Patricia Hernandez arrived as the sun was setting, carrying a cup of coffee for Jake and a manila envelope that contained the commendation paperwork for both officer and K-9. She sat in the chair beside Jake's, her presence offering comfort without demanding conversation. "The governor wants to present you both with the state's highest civilian honor," she said eventually. "There's going to be a ceremony, media coverage, Probably a book deal if you're interested." Jake shook his head slowly. "We didn't do this for recognition." "I know," Chief Hernandez replied. "That's what makes you heroes." As the night deepened and Millbrook settled into its familiar desert quiet, Jake found himself thinking about the children they'd saved. Sarah, Miguel, David, and Amy from Desert Rose Lane were already showing signs of recovery, their young resilience beginning to heal wounds that adults might carry forever. Maria Santos was home with her mother, surrounded by a community that had learned the value of paying attention to the invisible. Lucy Martinez and Jenny Morrison faced longer roads to recovery, but they were alive and safe and surrounded by people who would never let them disappear again. 15 children who might have vanished without a trace if not for an old dog's stubborn refusal to ignore what everyone else dismissed as imagination. At 11:43 p.m., Ranger opened his amber eyes one last time and looked directly at Jake with an expression of peace that transcended species and touched something eternal. The dog's tail managed one weak wag, and then he was gone, leaving Jake alone with memories of 14 years of unwavering loyalty and love. "Doctor." Thompson placed a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder as he wept over his partner's still form. "He knew," she said softly. "Dogs always know when their work is finished." He held on long enough to bring those children home. Outside the clinic windows, the desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars that had witnessed countless stories of loss and redemption. Somewhere out there, families were sleeping peacefully, knowing their children were safe. Somewhere else, other families were still waiting for miracles that might never come. But tonight, in a small veterinary clinic in Millbrook, Arizona, an old man said goodbye to the most faithful friend he had ever known and took comfort in the knowledge that their partnership had mattered in ways that would echo through generations. 6 months after Ranger's death, Jake Mitchell stood in the same spot where his partner had first alerted to the house on Desert Rose Lane, but everything had changed. The abandoned property had been demolished, replaced by a small memorial garden where desert marigolds bloomed in carefully tended beds. A bronze plaque embedded in a boulder of Arizona sandstone bore a simple inscription: "In memory of the children who were lost and the heroes who brought them home." The morning air carried the scent of creosote and sage, familiar desert perfumes that reminded Jake of early patrols with Ranger. He carried a thermos of coffee and a folding chair, planning to spend his retirement morning the way he'd spent most of them lately, remembering his partner and reflecting on the life they'd built together through service to others. At 68, Jake had officially retired from the Millbrook Police Department, though his days were far from empty. The commendation ceremony had indeed brought media attention, but more importantly, it had connected him with families across the country who were searching for missing children. The Jake Mitchell Foundation for Missing Children had grown from a kitchen table operation into a non-profit organization that provided resources and support for families navigating the bureaucratic maze of child recovery. Maria Santos, now 15 and thriving in high school, served as the foundation's youth ambassador. Her transformation from the hollow-eyed girl they'd found in that underground bunker to a confident teenager advocating for other missing children never failed to amaze Jake. She visited him once a month, always bringing stories about her grades, her friends, and her plans for college. "Mr. Jake," she'd said during her last visit, "I want to be a social worker. I want to help kids like I was helped." Those moments reminded Jake why the work mattered, why Ranger's sacrifice had meaning beyond the pain of loss. The memorial garden had become an unexpected gathering place for the community. Mrs. Eleanor Winston, now 83 and moving more slowly but still sharp as a desert thorn, maintained the plantings with help from local volunteers. Families with young children often brought picnic lunches to eat in the shade of the newly planted mesquite trees, their laughter a counterpoint to the solemnity of the memorial. Jake was arranging flowers near the plaque when he heard the familiar sound of paws on gravel. He turned to see a young German shepherd approaching, her coat a rich sable like Ranger's had been in his prime. Behind her walked Officer Tommy Rodriguez, now 35, and the department's new canine handler. "Morning, Jake," Tommy called out, his voice carrying the easy camaraderie that had developed between them over the past months. Luna wanted to pay her respects. Luna was 18 months old, a rescue dog from a military breeding program who had been donated to the Millbrook Police Department in Ranger's honor. She had the same intelligent amber eyes, the same noble bearing, and the same unwavering focus that had defined her predecessor. But she was her own dog, with her own personality and her own way of approaching the work. "She's been asking about you," Tommy continued with a grin. "Won't settle during training unless she gets her weekly visit with the legend." Jake scratched behind Luna's ears, feeling the familiar texture of German shepherd fur beneath his fingers. The young dog leaned into his touch, and for a moment Jake could almost imagine Ranger was there beside them, approving of his replacement's progress. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond Jake's initial vision. What started as a resource for families had grown into a comprehensive support network that included counseling services, legal advocacy, and a revolutionary alert system that bypassed traditional law enforcement channels when children from vulnerable populations went missing. The Ranger Protocol, as it had come to be known, ensured that no child's disappearance would be dismissed as a runaway case without thorough investigation. Dr. Sarah Beth Thompson had joined the Foundation's board of directors, bringing her expertise in animal-assisted therapy to help traumatized children heal through interaction with specially trained dogs. The program had been so successful that requests for expansion came from social service agencies across the Southwest. "Animals see what we miss," Dr. Thompson often said during training sessions for new therapy dogs. "They don't judge, they don't dismiss, they just love. Sometimes that's exactly what a broken child needs to start believing in safety again." The therapeutic power of the human-animal bond had become a cornerstone of the Foundation's approach. Children who couldn't bring themselves to trust adult counselors would often open up to a patient dog who sat quietly beside them, offering comfort without demanding explanations for their pain. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from his daughter Ashley in Portland. "Dad, saw the news story about the Foundation's expansion to Oregon. So proud of you and the legacy you're building. Love you." The relationship with his daughter had deepened since Ranger's death, as if losing his canine partner had opened space in Jake's heart for human connections he'd been too grieved to nurture. Ashley visited twice a year now, bringing her children to see their grandfather and learn about the importance of service to others. His grandson Michael, now 12, had become fascinated with police work and spent his summers volunteering at the Foundation's youth education programs. His granddaughter Sarah, 9 years old and named after the first child they'd rescued, wanted to be a veterinarian like Dr. Thompson. "Grandpa Jake," she'd said during their last video call, "when I grow up, I want to help animals, help people, just like Ranger helped you." Those words had brought tears to Jake's eyes, evidence that the lessons of loyalty, service, and compassion were being passed to the next generation. The Memorial Garden had also become a pilgrimage site for law enforcement officers from across the country. Canine handlers would make the journey to Millbrook to pay their respects to a dog whose story had become legendary in police circles. They would leave challenge coins, service ribbons, and handwritten notes at the base of the memorial stone. One particularly moving tribute had come from Sergeant Mike Chen's widow, who had traveled from California to thank Jake for giving Ranger a second chance at meaningful service after her husband's death in Afghanistan. She'd brought their teenage son, who had never met the dog who had served alongside his father, but wanted to understand the bond that connected warriors across species. Mike would have been proud, she told Jake as they stood together at the memorial. He always said Ranger was the best soldier in their unit. As the sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky, Jake settled into his folding chair and opened the morning newspaper. The headlines were full of the usual troubles: political divisions, economic uncertainties, social unrest. But buried on page 6 was a story that made him smile. A K-9 unit in Colorado had located 3 missing children using search techniques pioneered by the Ranger Protocol. The children were safe. The perpetrators in custody, and another family's nightmare had ended in reunion rather than loss. These victories accumulated like drops of water in the desert, small miracles that might seem insignificant individually, but together created an oasis of hope in a landscape often dominated by tragedy. Each child found, each family reunited, each predator stopped before they could claim more victims. These were the monuments that truly honored Ranger's memory. Jake's phone rang, displaying the number for the Foundation's office. His assistant, Carmen Gonzalez, had probably arrived early to prepare for the day's scheduled interviews with prospective therapy dog handlers. "Jake, we just got a call from a detective in New Mexico," Carmen said without preamble. "They've got a missing child case that sounds familiar. 7-year-old boy vanished from a playground. Local police are calling it a family abduction, but the grandmother insists something's wrong." She specifically asked for the Ranger Protocol. Jake felt the familiar tightening in his chest that accompanied news of another missing child. Even in retirement, even without his 4-legged partner beside him, the call to service remained as strong as ever. "I'll be right there," he said, already standing and folding his chair. As he walked back to his truck, Jake paused at the memorial stone and placed his hand on the warm bronze plaque. "Still working, old boy," he whispered. "Still bringing them home." The desert wind carried his words across the memorial garden, where desert marigolds nodded in approval, and the spirit of an old German shepherd seemed to wag its tail in eternal vigilance. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about romance, they're about the unbreakable bonds between souls who choose to serve others together. Jake and Ranger's partnership reminds us that purpose doesn't end with retirement, that the connections we forge through service create legacies that outlast our physical presence. In a world that often feels divided and uncertain, their story offers proof that loyalty, compassion, and the willingness to act when others look away can transform tragedy into hope. Every day, we have opportunities to be someone's hero, to notice what others miss, to trust our instincts about what's right. The question isn't whether we're too old to make a difference. It's whether we're brave enough to try. What moment in your life taught you the most about loyalty and service? Have you ever had an animal companion whose instincts guided you toward something important? Share your stories in the comments below. Let's celebrate the bonds that make us better humans.